Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Andra Gillespie. I'm the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference. And on behalf of the staff and the fellows of JWJI, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the start of the 2017-2018 Public Dialogues in Race and Difference series. The purpose of the James Weldon Johnson Institute at Emory University is to be a research center and a research hub that helps to coordinate and disseminate research on race, ethnicity, and all of its intersections at Emory and hopefully in the Southeast and throughout the United States. We're a research center, and what our job is today and in all of our programming is to help present research on race in a multiracial, interdisciplinary way. We also are a center that houses and welcomes scholars who are doing cutting-edge research on issues related to race, ethnicity, and difference, broadly speaking, so that they can actually complete their research projects. Because this is our first program of the year, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce and to welcome our staff who are milling about and to just honor them for all the hard work that they've done to put this program together. So first I'd like to recognize Dr. Kalia Sept Amen, who is the Assistant Director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute, who really helps coordinate all of this. Our accountant, Nita Spencer-Stevens, who I think has stepped out, but probably greeted you outside. Our administrative assistant, Latrice Carter. Our intern, Damali Britton. And I'd like to introduce our visiting fellows this year. So we have this semester 11 outstanding scholars from across the country who are doing fascinating work on issues related to race and difference. So if all of the visiting scholars for this year, if they could stand up. And I'll introduce briefly the ones who are standing: Dr. Carissa Threet from Spelman College, Dr. Ashante Reese from Spelman College, Derek Hanley from Carnegie Mellon University, Ashley Brown from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Taina Figueroa here at Emory, and Kiera Singleton from the University of Michigan. And there will be others later today. So the purpose of the Public Dialogue series is to provide a public forum to introduce people at Emory, whether they are students or faculty or staff, and members of the wider Atlanta community to the work that we do on race and difference here at Emory. This is going to be one of 4 evening events that we're going to host this year, so we're glad that you're here for this one. Hopefully you have heard about our upcoming panel in November on whiteness, and that you're signed up for that as well. There's a sign-in sheet on the outside. If you haven't signed in or dropped your card, that is how you'll get added to our list so that you'll know about both our public dialogue events and then also our weekly colloquium series. Before we get started with today's talk, I think we would be remiss to not acknowledge what has happened in the United States in the past week and to recognize that Puerto Rico is also part of the United States. And so we just wanted to start off by saying that our prayers are with the people of Puerto Rico right now. We know that there are Emory students who have been directly affected by Hurricane Maria, and we want you to know that our thoughts and our prayers are with you. The context in which we created this talk, is extremely momentous. In the past 9 months, we have watched our country debate whether or not we should ban Muslims from being able to travel to the United States. We have witnessed the Trump administration slash the quota for the number of refugees who who will be invited to seek shelter in the United States. President Trump has announced the ending of the DACA program and has increased deportation activity. And of course, there's always the talk of President Trump's promised border wall. So all of these beg the question of how we become American and if we're more likely to police the process of becoming American when the people coming are not white. So today we're going to take a 30,000-foot view of this particular perspective. We know that there is a lot of important activist work that's being done here, and we know that many of you perhaps are participating in those activities. And we want to honor that and also know that there is actually going to be a very hands-on applied conversation that will also happen on this campus later today at 7 o'clock. But as a research center, our greatest contribution to the movement is to take those pressing issues and to turn them into interesting, researchable, and empirical questions. So the panelists that we've assembled today have all published thoroughly and thoughtfully on these issues. They bring a wide interdisciplinary perspective, and they also bring a multiracial perspective that I hope will challenge us to think about immigration kind of beyond the Latino-white binary. So let me introduce the panel to you. Starting on my far left is Dr. Christina Greer. She's an associate professor of political science and American studies at Fordham University Lincoln Center. Her primary research interests are racial and ethnic politics, American urban politics, presidential politics, and campaigns and elections. She is the author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, which was awarded the W.B. Du Bois Best Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. She's working on her second book right now about the history of African Americans who have run for president of the United States. She also studies transportation, mayors, and public policies in urban centers. Her previous work has compared criminal activity in Boston and Baltimore, and also Baltimore and St. Louis. She got her BA from Tufts University and her PhD in political science from Columbia University. She's a member of the board of BAJI, which stands for Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and serves on the advisory board for Tufts University. She's also an ardent supporter of Fierce in New York City and Project South in Atlanta, Georgia. And she may look familiar to you because she is a frequent political commentator on MSNBC and New York One, and is often quoted in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Newsday, and the Associated Press. She also writes a weekly column for the New York Amsterdam News. Next to her is Dr. Alberto Davila, who is professor of economics at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, where he also serves as the Dean for Graduate Studies and Research and Administration in the Robert Vacker College of Business and Entrepreneurship at UT-RGV. Before joining the University of Texas RGV, or as it was previously known, the University of Texas Pan American, he was on the faculty at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Davila earned his PhD in economics from Iowa State University and his undergraduate degree in economics from the University of Texas Pan American. His research interests include the economics of the U.S.-Mexico border, the economics of immigration, and Hispanic labor markets. His research has been published in many academic journals, including the American Economics Review, Paper and Proceedings, Economic Development and Cultural Change, the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, Industrial Relations, the Journal of Population Economics, Economic Inquiry, Public Choice, and the Economics of Education Review, to name a few. He's also published work in edited volumes, and I want to point out his forthcoming book that he's writing with Dr. Marie Mora and Dr. Javidan Rodriguez, which is entitled Population, Migration, and Socioeconomic Outcomes Among Island and Mainland Puerto Ricans, La Crisis Boricua. And so that will be coming out shortly. Next to him is Dr. Terry Ann Jones. She's Associate Professor of Sociology and Anthropology and Director of the International Studies Program at Fairfield University. She studies international and domestic migration, particularly the movement between and within Latin America and the Caribbean and North America. Her research has compared Jamaican immigrants in the metropolitan areas of Miami and Toronto, examining the racial and ethnic settings and labor markets of the two areas. She also looks at the immigration policies of the two companies. Her book is entitled Jamaican Immigrants in the United States and Canada, Race, Transnationalism, and Social Capital. Her second book, Mass Migration in the World System, Past, Present, and Future, was an edited volume and published in 2010. She is currently engaged in research on seasonal domestic labor migration in Brazil. She studies the migration patterns of Brazilian sugarcane workers who travel from Brazil's northeast to the central and southeastern regions, with an emphasis on their living and working conditions. And she also is a co-editor of the book called Undocumented and in College, Students and Institutions in a Climate of National Hostility, which has just been published by Fordham University Press. And if you talk to her afterwards, she can tell you how you can get a discounted copy of that book. Next to her is Dr. Min Joo. She is professor of sociology and Asian American studies, and she's the Walter and Shirley Wang Endowed Chair in U.S.-China Relations and Communications and director of the Asia Pacific Center at the University of California, Los Angeles. She has also been the Tan Lark Tsai Chair Professor, Head of Sociology Division, and Director of the Chinese Heritage Center at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and the Chang Zhang Scholar Chair Professor of Sociology at Sun Yat-sen University in China. Her research areas are in the area of migration and development. Oh, thank you. Migration, adaptation, and integration, education in the new second generation, ethnic entrepreneurship, ethnic and racial relations, the Chinese diaspora, and the sociology of Asia and Asian America. She's published widely in these areas, including 17 books and more than 180 journal articles and book chapters. Most notable is the award-winning book, The Asian American Achievement Paradox, which she co-wrote with Jennifer Lee, and The Rise of the New Second Generation. She is the recipient of the 2017 Distinguished Career Award of the American Sociological Association section on international migration. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Sophia Jordán Wallace. She's Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington, Seattle. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of California, San Diego, and her PhD from Cornell University. Her research focus is on the politics of race and ethnicity, with a focus on Latino politics, representation, social movements, and immigration politics and policy. Her work has been published in the American Journal of Political Science, Political Research Quarterly, Politics, Groups, and Identities, American Politics Research, Social Science Quarterly, and Political Science Quarterly. She is co-founder and co-organizer of SPIRE, the Symposium on the Politics of Immigration, Race, and Ethnicity, which is an annual conference on race, ethnicity, and politics that she organizes. She's also the field director for Latino politics and immigration at the Washington Institute for the Study of Inequality and Race at the University of Washington. Her current book project is called United We Stand, Latino Representation in Congress, which looks at the ways that legislators serve the interests of Latinos across a wide variety of legislative activities, and she examines the substantive impact of Latino-identified representatives in Congress. So please join me in welcoming this panel. So I'm going to start with a question that is geared toward all of the panelists. So, many of us have been exposed to the images, whether in still photos or via video or television, of waves of immigrants who immigrated to the United States from Eastern and Southern Europe a century ago. So I want to ask, what is the same and what is different about immigration then and now? Do people come to the United States for the same reasons? Does America present the same opportunities now that it did then?
Yeah. I can start. Yeah. So, at the turn of the 20th century, we saw the second great wave of immigration in the United States. And that wave of immigration was the massive immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And that was the migration stream that was represented by the, what is described in the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, and your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. So at that time, the European immigrants coming to the United States for reasons of economic opportunities, bettering of their lives, and also political and economic religious freedom. So for these reasons, it stands for contemporary immigration, the third massive migration post-1965. And yet contemporary immigration, people come also for different reasons. And most notable is one, the refugee flow. So people are pushed out from their countries for hardship and disaster and stuff. And then also the other reasons for migration, because migration today is highly diverse, and then you have the highly skilled as well as the low skilled, and both the highly skilled and low skilled, the purpose of migration is not just for themselves, for their own betterment, but also for better opportunities for their children. So children's education is also one of the main reasons.
Before we continue, just want to be sure everybody's got their mics on, so just check.
Right, you guys can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that something that's remained the same is that a lot of our immigration is temporary, it's not permanent. So if you look at some of the recent work done by recent economics by scholars, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that a lot of this migration is people coming here, earning an X number of dollars, and then going back, because home consumption seems to be much more important than consumption here. So it is temporary migration, and as I move on, I'll talk a little bit more about this. I think the one thing that might have changed over time has to do with the idea that since the U.S. has advanced cutting edge technologies and higher institutions, that a lot of immigrants come here to obtain skills to go back home. So we need to keep that in mind. The other point to make, and this is more like not the same, I feel that a lot of our immigration now, or immigrants now, are harassed. They face a lot more duress than they did 100 years ago. That doesn't mean that there wasn't discrimination 100 years ago, but we now have a very well-funded immigration policy which aims to target certain immigrants from certain parts of the world. And this, in turn, has led to different dynamics in terms of migration flows, in terms of location flows, how people choose occupations, the proliferation of enclaves, as maybe people cannot find, returning homes, so they have to find a sub for home consumption, to even issues that have to do with English acquisition. In the past, 100 years ago, people acquired English to live the American dream. Now I dare say that a lot of people, immigrants, acquire English so to avoid detection from La Miga, as we call it. So
I would say when I argue on black ethnics, back then it was whites versus non-whites. And whiteness was this very protected category that they made sure groups could not get into, and that included Irish, Italians, Jewish, German folks. And now I think it's more blacks as this solo category, and lots of immigrants fighting to stay away from what they perceive as being the last place category, and sometimes that even goes for black immigrants as well. And unfortunately, I think we've reached a moment now where we have this conversation about good immigrants versus bad immigrants. And the bad immigrants are the ones who are the quote-unquote illegals, which that's not a term that I use. I don't know, but undocumented people, many of whom have overstayed their visas, but they're coming from countries that oftentimes are not necessarily stable, largely because of things that America has done or refused to do over time. And then the third point I want to make is, this hyper attention paid to, I guess, the browning or the blackening of the country, which is, at a certain point in time, there are only but so many white immigrants that you're going to be able to have. But, this obsession with the southern border in Mexico, where we don't actually, we're so concerned about undocumented people, we never have a conversation about Canadians. No offense to the Canadians in the room. But we know that, the Canadian border is much longer, much more porous than the Mexican border ever will be. And so that's this conversation of, at the heart of this country is white supremacy, anti-black racism, and this need to have a white majority. And as that gets to be less of a case, especially ideologically for a lot of the people in power, that's where we see this obsession with immigrants, immigration, good versus bad, and sort of the sending countries where people are coming from.
Yeah. So this actually is a nice segue into the next question, which and I'll start it with Min and Terry Ann, but if anybody else wants to jump in, feel free. A lot of our current debate about immigration focuses on so-called illegal immigration. So what did illegal immigration look like 100 years ago? And so was it different? And if so, what makes it different from the type of illegal immigration that we think about and debate today?
I could talk about illegal immigration 100 years ago because that concerns Chinese immigrants, Asian immigrants. But illegal or undocumented immigration then was not a big issue, even though there were undocumented immigrants into the country. It wasn't in the scholarly or public discourse. Even at the height of Asian exclusion, the undocumented immigration wasn't an issue. Rather, it was an issue of immigrants coming in and take jobs away from natives, and also the immigrants coming in posed as a moral, political, and economic threat. So moral threat being immigrants are coming from backward countries, they are subhuman, and they come in to take subhuman level of salaries and jobs, and they were brought in by captains to serve as rights breakers. So at that time, there were laws in place starting from the 1870s and 1982 passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to exclude Chinese laborers to come into the country. And then by 1917, all the exclusion acts were in place to exclude people from Asia. Literally anywhere east of Afghanistan, the countryside of the Asiatic zone. And then the 1944 National Origins Act established the National Origins quota system to restrict immigration, and those are the immigration of the second massive immigration, that is migration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Remember, today they are white, but in the past they were considered non-mainstream, non-white. They are a discriminated group. So the law prohibited them to come in. So when the law was in place, people are still continuing to come because the law only, block front door migration, but through networks or through the back door, people continue to come for various reasons. The most significant reason of all is because we need them, the economy needs them. So in a way, in the past, the undocumented immigration rhetoric or the anti-immigration, the discourse is very similar on the tone of this.
I agree. The discourse is similar. However, one difference that I would note is that prevention of immigration has become much more institutionalized, much more policed. And so we're seeing a lot more deportation now, a lot more identification of undocumented immigrants than there was during previous eras, even though there were undocumented immigrants at that time. What became known as the Immigration and Naturalization Services, the INS, for example, wasn't established until 1906. Prior to that, there wasn't any such institution. Now we have ICE, now Department of Homeland Security. There are all these institutions set up just to prevent immigration and to rid the country of unauthorized immigrants. And so that change I see as connected to perhaps the populations that are immigrating now that weren't immigrating 100 years ago.
I'd like to add to that. So I think, I agree with these points. I think that if we're specifically talking about Latino undocumented immigration, it's really important to consider that when we look at graphs that tell us, okay, this is what the percentage or even raw number of migrants were from this group over certain periods, you have to contextualize that information within the context of what other visas, what other temporary worker programs and things that are happening. So if you map on changes in the law in terms of the number of guest worker visas, the ending of the Bracero program, you'll see pretty dramatic changes in the total number of quote-unquote undocumented immigrants. But if you actually sum up all those numbers together, for in a given year in the different categories, it actually looks pretty similar. So some people, including a sociologist at Princeton, Doug Massey, have made the argument that sometimes even talking about your Latino undocumented population, you have to actually consider the fact that at certain times we essentially made people without, we put them in the category of not having papers because we still wanted their labor, but we didn't want to give them any documentation for doing that work, right? But our demand for their labor didn't actually change, right? We've had a consistent demand for that labor at lower wages for a really long time. And so I think that it's important for us to think about that. I think it's also important to think about, even in a context post the creation of ICE and formal mechanisms for enforcement, there has been a rapid and consistent shift over the last 30 years in terms of militarization along the southern border that has radically changed the ways in which the state interacts with undocumented people. And so it would be really common in the past, for example, that ICE or Border Patrol would engage in catch and release, and they would, come in contact with someone and somebody would go back over. Now there's much more formalized processes, and there's a lot more emphasis on trying to criminalize the behavior and up what we count as a so-called felony, and create harsher and harsher penalties that prevent people from being able to have a legal entry for 10 years, right? And so there's been a real movement towards that, and that's radically shifted how we treat the undocumented population.
So we talked about the 1924 National Origins Act. Just to provide some historical context, can we talk about what effect the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act had on immigration in the United States, particularly the demographic changes, and then also how that might have changed the rhetoric about immigration and undocumented immigration, before and after? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, the 1924 Act was actually the first Immigration Act, like if you will not count the Chinese Exclusion Act. Actually, the Chinese Exclusion Act is the one act, the National Immigration Act, that excludes people based on the national origin and race. So the 1924 Act was implemented because of the concern about the nation's assimilation capacity to assimilate the immigrants. But then when the Chinese or Asians were excluded, assimilation was not, like they were excluded from the melting pot. They were considered unassimilable. Yet the Southern and European immigrants, they were still part of the American dream. The nation is trying to assimilate the new immigrants. But since a lot of them are coming in a relatively short period of time, then there was concern about whether the nation has the capacity to assimilate them. So that result in the 1924 Act. So the 1924 Act actually is trying to exclude people from Southern and Eastern Europe. So immigration seems to be, as a result, to be at a low tide. But I would argue that even without the Immigration Restriction Act, immigration to America would have decreased because in the 1930s we have the Great Depression, and 1940s we have the war. So that stifle kind of decreased the immigration stream. And then after the war, and then in 1965, there wasn't much opposition to open up and liberalize the immigration law. So the 1965 immigration law is to abolish the national origins quota system that was established in the 1924 Act, and to give each country an equal footing for the nation to accept immigration. So as a result, it was almost an unintended consequences, because the law's purpose was, one, to meet the economic challenge of bringing in labor, needed labor, both highly skilled and low skilled, especially highly skilled. And second, to reunite families. So those are policy and humanitarian considerations. So as a result, actually, it puts restriction on migration from Mexico and Latin America, because that was not part of the 1924 restriction. It's part of the Western Hemisphere. So when the 1965 immigration law was reformed, it puts restriction on Mexican migration, but it opens up Asian migration. So after that, then the tide of migration, the composition of immigrant inflow shift from mainly European to mainly Asia and Central America. Like in the world, most of the international migrants originated from Asia, like 47% of it, and then 15% from Latin America and about 15% from Africa. But to the United States, about 57% from Latin America, mostly from Mexico and Central America, and then over a third from Asia. And then the flow is very diverse, especially those from Asia. It's, we call them hyper-selective. That means the groups, the major migrant group, like Chinese, Koreans, Indians, and Filipinos, they are hyper-selected group, meaning the proportion of college graduates from the immigrants group is higher than the population of the country they left behind, and also higher than the US population. And yet, you also have the hypo-selected group. That means it's mainly low-skill group, and there are sociological consequences of the group characteristics that are coming in to the United States. But in a nutshell, the 1965 Act changed the kind of the composition and social economic origin of the incoming migrants, making it more diverse.
So I have a question for Christina and/or Terry-Ann. So when we think about immigrants today, we typically think about someone coming from Asia or Latin America. However, there are many Blacks who immigrate to the United States from Africa or the Caribbean. So how is the experience of Black immigrants different from immigrants from other parts of the world? And how does that experience make Black immigrants politically and socially distinct from African Americans?
Well, we know that Caribbeans and Africans, when they get to the United States, they aren't really afforded the luxury of becoming Americans. They are oftentimes Americans with a mandatory Black prefix. So they often find themselves interacting with Black Americans in ways that other immigrant groups don't necessarily have to. So especially when we think about residential segregation, hyper-segregation of Black communities. But if anyone here is from New York, is anyone here from New York? So, you know, unfortunately, we have this horrible thing called stop and frisk. That it's getting better, but in many communities across the country, police officers will target Black communities primarily and just stop them and see if they have, you know, 5 ounces of weed or whatever it is on them. But if you are a Black immigrant, especially if you're an undocumented immigrant, what could start off as sort of a low-level stop and frisk could all of a sudden become an ICE intervention. And so New York City, just a few months ago, actually made it a non-criminal offense to jump a turnstile or to be caught with weed. So back in the day, if you jumped a turnstile or if you were caught with a small sack of weed, that meant you immediately went to Rikers, especially if you couldn't pay your bail. But in Rikers, they just stopped this just a few months ago, ICE agents were allowed to look through the files and see who was possibly documented and sort of run your name through the system. So if you're a Black immigrant and you're living in a Black neighborhood and your Black neighborhood is already hyper-surveilled, then you're at sort of a double capacity of threat from the state. So that's something that Black immigrants face that a lot of immigrants don't in the same exact ways. I think also a lot of, especially African immigrants, unfortunately fall into the bad category of undocumented, because we know that Africa is far away. The 54 countries, it takes a lot of resources, social networks, political networks, economic networks to get here. So many people are here on a visitor, some sort of tourist visa or a work visa or a student visa. So when they become undocumented, it's because they actually had permission to be in the country at one point in time, but for whatever reason, they didn't leave during that allocated amount of time, which then puts them in the bad category. So when they find themselves predominantly living with Black communities and hyper-surveilled, that makes them a double target again for essentially a low-level offense that, you know, all of us in this room have committed crimes, some large, some small, right? But for people who are in a precarious status, they essentially have to live lives as perfect citizens, which none of us do. And that goes from everywhere from jaywalking to traffic violations to, you know, drinking alcohol, you know, 5 feet off of the curb, whatever it may be, in a situation that could essentially ruin their lives and the lives of their families, right? Because this is a situation where if you lose one person within your family unit or your community, that can have devastating effects for everyone else.
I would add to that that there are identities forced on Black immigrants. At the one extreme, as Christina pointed out, they all become African American. They all become part of one community. On the other extreme, though, there are those who insist on comparing, on creating this model minority status that they often assign to whether it's Caribbean immigrants or African immigrants. That I often reject these comparisons because it really isn't a fair comparison when you are taking a positively self-selected group of immigrants who, on the basis of their education or employment, are able to enter the country and then comparing them with a larger population. I've found in my own research that rather than have this kind of hierarchy of Blacks in the United States, it's more useful to think about how they've interacted with each other. And what I've found is that Caribbean immigrants in particular, and I would go as far as to say Black immigrants in general, have benefited from the long presence of African Americans in the United States who have paved the way. As Andrea pointed out, I've done comparative studies of the US and Canada, and I found that where the US is at an advantage is in having this long history of Blacks here, on which other Black immigrants can then benefit from what they've established. This isn't the case in somewhere like Canada, where Caribbean or African immigrants are really the pioneers, the ones trying to establish policies that have long existed here in the United States. And so I would venture away then from these comparisons, from these divisive ways, and to think not of Black immigrants and African Americans as this monolithic group, but not to make either group representative of the larger population. We don't do that with other populations, with the majority populations.
And can I just add on? I mean, I talked about this explicitly in the book. I mean, I say I created elevated minorities because I was like, Black folks will never be considered model minorities the way Asian Americans and whites and certain Latinos are. So it's like they're considered somewhat better than Black Americans, but clearly not yet a model minority. But I think Terry Ann's point is spot on, where it's like when we're looking at Black immigrants in particular, but a lot of immigrants, you know, you're looking at a certain bushel of apples. And so where this comparative analysis comes from with Black Americans, lots of times it's like, oh, well, these super smart Caribbeans are at Emory. Why aren't the native, you know, Black Atlantans here? And it's like, well, when we're looking at Black Americans, it's the entire orchard, A through Z. When you're looking at Black immigrants, because of the political, economic, and social difficulties that it takes to actually get to this country, you're just looking at certain bushels that are here and not the entire orchard, right? So there are lots of derelicts in countries all across the world, right? You have to have a certain sort of motivation and a set of resources to actually come to this nation. So it's actually not a fair comparison. And the competitive nature so embedded in this, I think, again, rooted in anti-Black racism of the United States, which is why aren't these Black Americans sort of working and achieving at levels of everyone else, but no one else has the same history of non-voluntary migration to this nation that we see in other areas.
So I want to expand the conversation to think about sort of the different paths that people got to America with. So African Americans largely came here against their will. But have this larger community that Black immigrants can then kind of come into, and with all of its flaws, kind of become part of this larger community. So what does that look like in an Asian American and the Latino context, where people are coming for different reasons, people were here already, and then you also are dealing with this larger issue of kind of pan-ethnicity in ways that Christina and Terry's work kind of problematizes for African Americans, but that has been something that has been the hallmark of kind of Asian American and Latino studies for, since their inception. So what would that look like? This is for Min and for Sophia.
So I think for Latinos, I would say that it's, the U.S. is unlike Latin America to the extent that the way in which we have large racial groups and what the groups are, at least, is not the same, right? So if you're a Latin American immigrant and you're coming to the U.S., you learn pretty quickly, okay, there's a group that's black, there's a group that's white, there's a group that's Asian, and there's a group that's Latino. There's a group that here they call Native Americans or Indian Americans that in our prior home country we call indigenous people. And there's this other category, new category, MENA, that I don't quite understand yet, right? That's kind of the way that Latino immigrants are thinking about it. And they realize, okay, in this context, we're all Latino, basically, is how the way other people will see them. And we're all, at some level, there is this perpetual foreignness that's attached to you in that group, right? And so this does not mean that Latino immigrants come here and they're not like, oh, I'm Mexican American, or I'm Chicano, or I'm Peruvian, or El Salvadorian, whatever. They're pretty much, Latino politics has said there is very much national origin, country-based ethnic identities that exist in the US context, but we also find that Latinos do adopt a pan-ethnic identity that's across the whole group. Now, lots of people, particularly outside the group, but even within the group, say, well, but there's so much heterogeneity within the group. How can there be such a thing? Well, we know at least empirically that the large proportion of Latinos in the US buy into it. So even if other people think it's nonsense, we know that Latinos not only have created, there was an explicit creation of this label through the state, but also amongst activists. We know that that label is also powerful politically. And so the label connects people who have different backgrounds. So it connects people who are foreign-born, people who are first gen, second gen, third gen. So this does not mean that we don't observe differences between generation statuses in political attitudes or in political behavior. We do. But we do know that there can also be a unifying identity that mobilizes Latinos as a group. So if we think about examples like attacks on Latinos through Prop 187 in California, or Arizona SB 1070, or Sensenbrenner in 2006, under all those cases, we saw mass mobilization of Latinos as a group, independent of whether they specifically were undocumented or foreign-born or had become LPRs or naturalized citizens. We saw across all groups mobilization, right? And so that's where we see that this pan-ethnic identity can actually bind groups together. But I do think it's important to say, this does not mean, though, that there isn't heterogeneity within the group and that there are pretty serious differences and different reasons for migration and different backgrounds in migration, right? So you escaping terrible crime and violence in Central America is really different than, say, somebody who's coming from Chile, for example, who comes from a very wealthy background, right? And may even phenotypically present as white. And this also doesn't mean that phenotypically all Latinos are the same and that there isn't messed up problems with anti-blackness and racism within the Latino community, both in Latin America, like in their respective countries, but also here. That doesn't just disappear when people come here. So I think that's important. But we do find a lot of evidence that the pan-ethnic identity, people do identify with it, and there is power in it politically.
Yeah, I agree that pan-ethnicity is kind of a self-empowering identity, and it is an American identity. It's an identity that immigrant groups are adapting to this country. It's part of the integration and assimilation process, so to speak. But there is also the side of it that is racialization, that the groups, they are racialized into a pan group, like the same experience as the Caribbean or African immigrants. They got racialized into African Americans, and there are negative stereotypes or stereotyping attached to it. For example, the Asians, just part of the Asian American community from immigration of the highly skilled, so they are hyper-selected group. So even the hyper-selected subgroups from Asia, like Southeast Asians and some were from low social economic background of the same hyper-selected group, they got kind of racialized into a model minority. And then, whereas like Latinos, they got racialized into an undocumented kind of label. So both the racialization, like model minority or undocumented immigrants, they have significant social consequences, both for the first generation and the second generation. And then the foreigners, like they are forever foreigners. The foreigners image, it constantly gets invoked when on the ground, when people interact with other people, including immigrants themselves, about this image of you are the outsider, you are not part of us.
So I have a question for Alberto. So what role do immigrants play in the U.S. economy? We hear all the time that immigrants take jobs away from U.S.-born people. Is that true? Is it true that immigrants drive down wages?
Well, let me just start off. I will answer that question. Christina just brought up a very interesting concept of the bad immigrant and the good immigrant that was injected into the economics, in a different context in the economics literature in the 80s by a very famous labor economist, George J. Borjas, who's now a Harvard professor. He was at San Diego, but then moved on to Harvard. Where he did a study where he basically claimed, theoretically and empirically, that if you were from certain parts of the world, these immigrants were good immigrants in the United States. If you were from other parts of the world, you were not. Essentially, if you came from a welfare state, say, for example, Germany, if you're in the top 10% of German dentists, if you come to the United States, you're going to be in the top 10% of dentists here, so you're going to be doing much better than average. And he mentioned like Latin American immigrants and from other countries coming from a non-welfare states. So this good, bad became a very popular idea in economics among immigration scholars. Since then, there have been other studies that have dispelled some of this empirical work. Chikhyar and Henson, for example, show that migration costs fall as skill levels increase, et cetera, et cetera. But this good versus bad immigrant was introduced. The short of it, to answer the question, immigration is good. Immigration is good. It adds wealth. And I could go through some of this, but let me just give you a very simple example. My air conditioning broke down on Saturday of last week, okay? So I had the choice of getting the new AC unit from a US native, or an immigrant. Well, the immigrant gave me a much better deal. Okay, so I hired the immigrant. He saved me a bunch of money. Okay, so I essentially took away the job from a native to an immigrant. But does the story stop there? It doesn't stop there. I took the dean's office staff to a very nice lunch this Tuesday. The cook is happy, the native entrepreneur in that restaurant is happy, everyone's happy. My wife and I are going to Nashville for Thanksgiving. I'm gonna buy some special stuff in Nashville, okay? Because I have some extra money, and that's gonna go into the pockets of me. So at the end of the day, immigration is good. It adds wealth to a country. And it goes way back to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. As an economist, what is the wealth of a nation? It's resources. And drop what? So immigration is good.
So now, what if we drill down a little bit? And so if in the global view, immigration is a net good, what if you're a working class person in the United States? Is there more competition between immigrants and working class people? And so if you could talk about that from an economic perspective, Alberto, and then from a public opinion perspective.
So yes, we have, obviously we've been using the term illegal immigrant, which The worst one is illegal alien, like if someone is being down an alien in an illegal country or something. The term's undocumented work. Okay, again, one has to look at different layers of this conversation. On the one hand, it is true. I would say it's empirically true that undocumented workers who come to the United States and directly compete with U.S. natives in some jobs, the U.S. natives will experience lower wages, job losses, etc. But the story doesn't end there, just like my air conditioning unit story, right? Us as consumers, our purchasing power is going to go up, right? We're going to buy more stuff, and that's going to create more jobs for natives. Some of these undocumented workers work together with some U.S. natives. So their wages also go up. Their employment also goes up. So yes, there are some workers that are hurt by undocumented workers, but in total, that is not.
Sophia?
I just want to say, though, that on that specific point, I think that, so two things. So I think that this is a false dichotomy when we set up this idea about native workers versus immigrant workers and whether they are taking their jobs or stealing their jobs. In fact, that type of stereotyping and scapegoating is basically as old as the debate of immigration in this country. And what the empirical research tells us, though, is that a lot of the jobs that, even if we're comparing low-skilled immigrants to low-skilled natives, they're not necessarily even competing in the same industries. If we look at what are the industries that low-skilled immigrant workers work in the most, one of the top areas is agricultural type jobs. We also have domestic service jobs. We also have construction and other things. When you compare what low-skilled natives do, that's actually the kind of distribution of jobs looks really different. And so, for example, sales positions, clerks in kind of stores, these are much more likely to be low-skilled type positions that natives have. And one of the reasons for that is because one of these skills that a lot of low-skilled natives have, compared to they immediately have it from the gate as opposed to they have to learn over time, is English, right? And certain number of professions, and there is an immigration strand of literature that's starting to look at high language usage jobs and how that complicates our discussion of comparing low skilled, but even in different high skilled jobs, there's a different degree to which you must be conversational versus not. And I'm not trying to say that immigrants don't speak English, because again, the literature tells us the process has always been over multi-generations, people absolutely learn English. But the idea that they're directly competing in the same jobs isn't quite actually what's really happening. So you have to caveat that. But I do want to really reinforce Alberto's point, though, that you have to adopt a broader view when you're talking about what's the net effect of immigration. And it's not even just the broader economy. It's also what happens in the next generation of the children of immigrants. What are the contributions of those children? What is their educational attainment, the degree to which they contribute to the economy, to the population, to the community? And all the evidence tells us that if we're looking at an overall net balance, immigration is positive for economic growth. And cuts to immigration will hurt the country. And economists who by nature are not a very, what we would describe as a liberal progressive group of people, that's fair, right? So we can't say, oh, well, economists are only saying this because they're liberals. No, on average, they actually are more conservative in what they say. Their assessments are very conclusive that immigration is a net positive and it leads to growth of the country, because that's what they do when they study, right? So they wouldn't say that if that wasn't true. I think it's also important to say that Borjas did do a very controversial study that was ripped apart by many, many people across disciplines, but he recently was part of a national group of scholars across disciplines that was involved in they released, it was the 2016 report of the National Academics of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. They evaluated exactly this question: is it a net positive of immigrants economically? And they said, on balance, absolutely yes. And even he signed on to that agreement, and they looked at a systematic analysis. Now moving to the point of threat and economic threat, again, Economic scapegoating of immigrants is very old. That's a stereotype. It's a way in which to build anti-immigrant sentiment, right? And this is actually being used as a device to try to pit people of color against each other as well, right? So in the last election, we saw a real uptick in political ads that tried to represent Latinos and Latino immigrants as hurting Black people, right? And so they tried to specifically put them together physically in an ad to pit them against each other to try to break up potential alliances between groups and to build negative sentiment, right? Again, not a lot of evidence that this is actually true, but that doesn't mean it's not a very powerful rhetorical device. It doesn't mean that the perception of threat doesn't have real consequences on how people feel about immigrants, but also how they may vote politically, what they support. Perception is almost as important as whether it actually is true, right? If you perceive it to be true in your mind psychologically, we know that's almost as good as it actually being true. So feeling and believing that immigrants are hurting us economically is a very powerful motivator, but many scholars would argue is often masking underlying prejudice and negative animus towards immigrants that has nothing to do with actual threat or actual harm and has everything to do with more cultural threat and racial threat.
Let me just add 2 points to what Sophia was saying. One is the job competition. So we see that there is in some sectors, there is a direct replacement between immigrant labor and native labor. For example, domestic service. In the past, is predominantly Black, female Black labor. And then today is predominantly Latino women labor. But when you look at the cohort change, today, the younger generation of African Americans, their level of education has increased tremendously. So because of increased education, so they are not into the domestic work. So it seems that they are taking jobs away from natives. But actually, not only that they are not competing on the same job, even when they are competing on the same job, the natives, the level of education is way over than the job actually requires. So why should we require the native minority workers to take this low wage job when my education level should be qualified for a higher skill job? So that's one point I want to make. The other point is immigrants, they are consumers as well as they are they move the economy too. Not only they are consumers, but they are entrepreneurs as well. So with the availability of a wide range of skill levels, they are able to stimulate and strengthen our nation's economy and make the United States still the #1 economy and the strongest economy in the world. So, and then they are, a lot of immigrants, they are also creating jobs for themselves as well as for natives. So it's not like the job competition part of it has a lot of nuances within. And then, when you are debating, you tend to have the discourse based on the observation and not based on the actual fact.
So Alberto, I'm going to get back to you in a second. I want to give Christina the floor, but as you answer the question, can you also think about this, about sort of African-American attitudes towards immigration and whether or not they are approaching this issue from a nativist standpoint or whether or not they're looking at this in terms of minority solidarity?
Right, so I was just going to lead right into it. But I did want to just make a point for history, just because this country, by and large, is ahistorical. And so let's also remember that, Black women, as Min said, were largely domestics for many, many centuries in this nation. And let's not forget that FDR, in making the compromises that he had to do to get the New Deal passed, he excluded Black women as domestics out of a category that was eligible for Social Security benefits, which has had long-standing effects for the replication of wealth in this country. So yes, everything's based on compromise, but when you had to throw a group under the bus, he threw Black women under the bus. That's one. So two, let me go back to your point about how Blacks sort of view immigrants. I think on the one hand, Black folks aren't buying it, right? And geography does matter. So I think, we saw this in LA for many, many years. There was never a Latino mayor because white mayors would always go to the Black community and say, if we get a Latino mayor, everyone's gonna be speaking Spanish and everything's gonna be gone, and so you all should just stick with us. And so I think a lot of Black people for a certain period of time were just like, yeah, there is this fear, right? Because there's this perception of scarce resources. And the reason why I say it's a perception of scarce resources is because it's the United States. There's no such thing as scarce resources. We just found $700 billion last week, right? Like, we have money when we want to find money. So when it comes to cities, though, it's this perception of scarce resources, and oftentimes white politicians have been really successful in pitting Black and Latino communities against one another to make sure that they stay in power. And we definitely saw that in the 2016 election. I think we'll still see a lot more of it because, no, the competition of jobs is not the same, but if you are constantly feeling like you're under threat, especially economically and politically, then this perception of any other group that could come in and possibly usurp you, and obviously, whenever we talk about the census, it's, Blacks are now the #3 group, Latinos have already surpassed you, right? So there's this narrative of you should be fearful of this group that's, becoming so much larger in number, and you're being outnumbered. So that's one. But then, so I don't think a lot of Black folks are buying it. But in certain geographic spaces, we do have to have a real honest conversation. So when you look at, say, second-tier cities, and I'm talking about, again, no offense, Cleveland's, Detroit's, Pittsburgh's of the world, these are cities that suffered not just white flight, but middle-class flight, right? And the only people who were left were Black folks. And Black folks of a certain class, sort of working middle and lower. And so they essentially kept these cities afloat for decades when it was just destitute. And so now these cities are experiencing a resurgence. White folks now want cities, so cities are back, right? And so a lot of these cities are, listen, when I started graduate school, they're like, cities are dead. I was like, but Black people live in cities. They're like, but no one lives in cities. I was like, but Black people live in cities. So now cities are back, I guess. White people have cities. But these second-tier cities now are having this resurgence, and they're asking, the mayors are, sort of saying, hey, immigrants, especially Asian and Latino immigrants, you guys are entrepreneurs, right? You're going to come here. Not only are you going to start businesses, but you're not just going to make money. You're also going to spend money. So we want you in our new city to help rebuild the city. And Black folks are looking around saying, well, we've always been here. Where were these grants that you're offering? Where are these new special housing opportunities that you're offering? All these new things that these cities are coming up with to try and get populations back to support immigrant communities that they now want in their cities have never been offered and still aren't offered to the native Black American population. So that, I think, is sort of a new area of research for those of you who are interested, where we might see in public opinion a much deeper now dissension of people who have felt, Black Americans who have felt left behind, and now there's certain policies that will further leave them behind, literally on the backs of new immigrants coming to their city, which I think is just going to be a new area of research.
So we're going to open it up for 20, 25 minutes, but before we do that, I want to ask a last set of questions to the audience, and I'll let Alberto start. But since you mentioned 2016, Christina, let's talk about the policy proposals that are the consequences of 2016. So we all know that President Trump's marquee proposal was to build a wall on the US border with Mexico. So first, Alberto, if you could just run through the cost-benefit analysis of this wall and talk about the economic merits of it. And then also, we just want to understand why people like the idea of this wall. And so, Sophia, if you could talk just a little bit more. So is this about economic interests, or was this about racial self-interest?
Well, the border wall is a bad idea. I live on the border. I'm a border resident. I was born along the border. I don't know if too many people along the border would think this is a good idea. But as an economist, I could tell you that there are some issues with regards to the border, other than I guess the people that are going to be building the border are going to be making some money building the border. And that it goes back to one of my original points on migratory flows. Has anyone considered, well, I guess some people have considered this, what that would do to undocumented immigrants in the United States. If you build a wall, and you make it very hard and impossible people to cross back, will you want to go back to your country of origin? That might increase, and there's been some research done in this area, that might increase the length of stay of undocumented workers, so it goes against the whole idea of reducing undocumented immigration. Then there's the unintended consequences. You know how angry Mexicans are about this? I was just in Mexico City at one of their major Universidad Autónoma de Mexico, which is a huge university. That's all they talk about. The border wall, why are they doing this? Why does the US hate us? Yes. I mean, that's the thought. Where I come from, Mexican consumers bring in billions of dollars. They cross on a daily basis to buy stuff from US companies. So what's going to happen to those consumers? What's going to happen to the area where I live? Mexican consumers might not cross anymore. Then a learned colleague, he calls himself a learned colleague from the border, told me forget about human flows. You know why some people are against the border? Well, because wildlife will be impacted by this. This moving back and forth is going, I mean, there are actually some jokes about the border wall, and there's going to be a new Olympic competition. But say that it's affected, it's going to reduce the flow of not only human beings, but of important things such as wildlife, which are very important to our ecosystem. So, for me, if you get one point from this, the border wall is a bad idea.
Yeah, let me just say that, you know, I'm actually very reluctant to engage and talk about the wall. One, because I come from the position that even just the idea of constructing a wall is a deeply, deeply racist idea. And so even validating that for me is a little problematic. And it's also a complete fantasy in the sense that actually executing it, I often think about, have people spent no time in the borderlands? Do they not know what the border is actually like? Do they not realize how long it is? Do they not realize that we've already built portions of fence that have cost incredible amounts of money and do nothing but divert people to other places where there's no fence? Also, lots of private homeowners own land on the border. To create a wall, the government would have to use eminent domain to take all their property, okay? The one thing we know about people in the US is white people are really intense when it comes to property rights, okay? And that's fundamental. So let's not pretend like that's not a minor thing in this. Number two, just there's rivers, bodies of water. How do you build it? So there's all these problems on top of the idea that it's racist. Why is it so appealing though? Well, it's really appealing because our entire immigration debate is built on myths and misinformation and smoke and mirrors about the realities of immigration, but also the border, right? We've known for so long that actual crossings over the border have gone down so low that most people, the largest group of undocumented people, are overstaying visas, meaning they're not crossing through that border, okay? When they become undocumented, they literally did not get on a plane or a bus to go home, okay? So part of the thing is that it feeds into this narrative, though, that we have, right? And anthropologists in particular, Leo Chavez, is well documented. The way in which immigration is covered in this country feeds onto a narrative of an uncontrollable flood of people. So the flood imagery, people standing in a line, there's all these different stereotypical negative imagery that's used. And the public absorbs that imagery, and so the border wall fits directly into that narrative, and it sounds really appealing, like, oh, we're going to stop the flood of people through this wall. Never mind the fact that migrants are now going to places that are not traditional gateway cities, and there's all these new immigrant destinations, never mind the fact that people are overstaying visas, never mind the fact that we have exponentially increased resources to the border, militarization, ICE budgets, number of agents, everything that you look at in enforcement, it has increased under both Democrat and Republican presidents. Okay, Obama deported more people than anybody. So the idea that we haven't spent energy on enforcement just isn't true. But if the narrative, the public narrative, just like my argument about the threat perception economically, the narrative is that undocumented immigration is completely out of control and we haven't done anything about it, then this feeds into that. And people who are motivated by cultural and racial threat, it lets them believe, oh, we're going to be safe from Spanish. Spanish isn't going to take over. Brown people aren't going to be everywhere. Latinos aren't going to be everywhere. Asian people aren't going to be everywhere. Again, more of the Latino population and Asian population is actually US born than even foreign born. It's only a third of Latinos are foreign born. People are somehow living in some alternate world regarding this. But again, it feeds into their fears, their stereotypes, and their racist anti-immigrant sentiments. That's really why it's so attractive, because it absolutely is not pragmatic politically in any way or possible physically.
Yeah, but if you're a presidential candidate who says Mexicans are rapists, it fits in perfectly.
Yeah, right? No, it does. It fits a narrative, right? And it definitely fits this idea of these are the wrong kind of immigrants that you want, right? It feeds the narrative of we must build a wall to keep out bad people.
And in terms of the volume of undocumented immigration, you're right. Despite the wall that has already been built, and despite the enforcement and militarization of the border, undocumented immigration from Mexico actually has declined a bit. It remains stable, but yet the undocumented immigration from Asia, from other countries, had increased and surpassed undocumented immigration from Mexico. So a lot of the undocumented immigration now is not from the South. From the South, you know, the stream is constant, we already know, with or without the border, because of the Mexican-US long-standing relationship and also economic, social, family relations. So the war doesn't do anything.
I would just add briefly that we've never seen anywhere in the world evidence of physical boundaries preventing or motivating more migration. It can make it more dangerous, but there are other factors, economic conditions, violence, conflict, that determine flows of migrants, not walls.
So I also want to ask about a proposal that has been proposed by a bill by Senator Tom Cotton and Georgia's own David Perdue, which has gotten the endorsement of President Trump. It's called the RAISE Act. And one of the key components of the RAISE Act is to actually cut the number of visas that would be given to people to immigrate legally to the United States. And it also is going to make it harder for family reunification to take place. So if there's somebody who wishes to immigrate to the United States who already has family living here under the RAISE Act, it's actually going to be harder to do those things. What are the merits and the demerits of this proposal?
I mean, let's just be clear. Anything that is coming out of this administration has roots in white supremacy.
Correct.
That's just what it is, right? This administration is obsessed with making sure that the white majority is maintained. So if you look at this, if you look at the countries where they're trying to make sure these reunifications do not happen, these are all brown and black countries. They want to make sure that if immigrants are going to come here, they're from these perceived white nations. That is clear. Like, it is literally in black and white. I mean, any policy that is coming out of this administration right now, they are all but same, right? So we can look at this act and they can say, no, we're not cutting off immigration completely, but we're damn sure going to make sure that it's not from the colored nations, right? And so even with the Muslim ban, so he wants to make sure it can get through the Supreme Court. I'm just going to make sure I just add on some random countries that are Muslim, so it's not a Muslim ban. So it's like Venezuela. What have they ever done? It's like that, right? Chad. So I mean, it's like he literally, because this is a man who hasn't read the Constitution and doesn't like to read, which is what he has said. This is my opinion. These are facts. He's literally just picking out countries, literally out of the air. So when we look at all these new policies, there are countries that are black and brown countries that he wants to, and Asian countries that he wants to make sure are banned, but it's anything, the answer to everything with this particular administration is rooted in a white supremacist notion of what this country was and what they want it to be moving forward.
So I want to end with this final question. So it's kind of provocative. Sure, go ahead.
I just want to say it's also that this policy proposal is really counter to what the 1965 Act was about. The 1965 Act, one of the primary components had to do with family reunification. So this is a really marked departure from that. One of the reasons why we think we care about family reunification is not just because of humanitarian reasons that people want to be with their family, but it's also that empirically we know that that helps with assimilation, integration, and a success. So much the same to Alberto's point that the wall would in many ways be counterproductive even if you could execute it. So with this policy, cutting immigration levels so low is definitely going to hurt economic growth. It will hurt the integration into communities. It will further isolate immigrants. It will do all the things that people who want this proposal really criticize and don't like, or they say are problems in the immigrant community. But I also want to suggest that fundamentally the RAISE Act is just like really inhumane, and it's inhumane in the sense that it wants to cut people off from social ties permanently, but it also wants to dramatically reduce the number of refugees, which I think if we consider that, it means that you believe that because you were by birth lucky and just by random chance were born in the United States, that you have a supreme right that's more important than people who are in other countries who's literally facing life and death, that they are just essentially out of luck and should die because they were born in not the United States. And that in some ways is very inhumane and lacks empathy and compassion for other people, which again I would argue is something that we've seen through a lot of the president's actions, particularly most recently in his behavior towards Puerto Rico.
And the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Yes.
Let's not forget them too, right? But I think that this goes to a larger point where we have a president who is incapable of showing empathy, right? And if we look at the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Immigration Act is a triumvirate of acts passed by LBJ, signed by LBJ, right? We can look at the COBOC Commission, everything that this administration does, as a systematic rollback of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Immigration Act. The COBOC Commission is essentially trying to make up, these fake boogeymen, Chicago style, everyone's voting early in office, which completely is not the case, but we know that that directly ties into the Immigration Act in trying to pull people out of civic engagement, which completely rolls over our civil rights. So the same way we saw this triumvirate of acts enacted in the 60s, we're seeing a perfect rollback in the 50s. All three are in a triangle. Every time we see our voting rights sort of taken away, it's a part of our civil rights, and we can look at it, and it's also immigrant communities being targeted. So, yeah.
So I want to, so that we can turn to questions from the audience, I want to ask this question. People often describe our immigration system as broken. So in your opinion, is it broken? Why or why not? And if so, what would you do to fix it in a way that would be humane?
I would say it's broken. I would say that if I were a king and I had a magic wand, I would open all the borders and let everyone do whatever they want to do. But that's not politically feasible. But what I would say is there are some things that can be done, like Min was talking about, for example, expanding the EB-5 program, the employer-based program that promotes immigrant entrepreneurs to come to the country, create jobs, start businesses. That's positive. Also, I would say that to open up the border to STEM field immigrants. There is a big need for skilled workers in the United States. And this is where the economist in me comes out, and I'm sorry about that. That's okay. But I'm a big believer, and I've written about this, in a robust national identification system. If the concern is, and this is primarily impacted Hispanic populations, that there are employers out there that might not hire you if you're Hispanic because you might be undocumented. So if you had a national ID that said, I am a native of this country, or I'm legally here, that excuse would be taken away.
I would add that policy making should not be isolated from one another. So immigration policy is a national policy. It's only one side of how to make the country better. So immigration policy is important, but even if we have a policy to cut immigration volume in half, to just allow the highly skilled, we still have the unintended consequences of reinforcing the existing social stratification system, reproducing inequality, even with the incoming of immigrants, because we are needing their skill, and both highly skilled and low skilled. So in other words, immigration policy should be hand in hand, the policy making, with the nation's educational policy for the children, both for native and for the children of immigrants. And also we should keep in mind the U.S. is, in the world. So we are living in a globalized world, and we should not isolate ourselves as, one, but we are part of the world. So the globalized economy, you would lose out if you have a restrictive immigration policy.
I would agree that the system is broken, primarily because you have this large population of millions of people forced to live clandestine lives, forced to not reach their full potential because they're living their lives as undocumented immigrants. And I would say that one thing that's really lacking from the U.S. immigration system is balance. I'm critical of the Canadian system, which the RAISE Act is often compared to the Canadian system, but it really is far from it. And although I'm critical of the Canadian system, I would say that it does have this balance where it leaves room for skilled workers, unskilled workers, family reunification, humanitarian migration, which is very important and something that the U.S. seems to be increasingly taking away from. And so I think in order to have less undocumented immigration, less unauthorized immigration, you have to have more authorized immigration. And it's best from both perspectives to have this balance, particularly in terms of humanitarian or refugee.
It's completely broken in so many ways. I mean, some of the really critical ways that absolutely has to be fixed is that we can't have an honest discussion about what to do on immigration policy if we don't address the fact that there are more than 11 million people who are undocumented, who are living in the shadows. Every time we pretend that that doesn't exist, we are at zero and nothing's happening, okay? We absolutely have to normalize people's status, and then we can start on some other point. We have to do that even if you are a person who espouses restrictive immigration views. You can't think it's a good idea to have 11 million people that you don't know where they are in the country, what's happening, living in the shadows, unafraid, or possibly afraid to contact police when bad things happen in their communities. They can't be agents necessarily that work together with police to help things. Like, there's no good that comes from this except for exploitive labor practices. That's the only good, okay? And obviously, you can probably guess that I have problems with that. Have to do something about that. Absolutely have to devote more resources to the immigration backlog. A lot of people, this doesn't get a lot of media attention. The waits are so long to change your status. Even when people say, well, why didn't they get in the line? First of all, there's often no line to get in, so there's no way to actually get in a line. But even if you are in a line, it takes so long, and we don't put enough resources to the literal bureaucracy that does it, the kind of administrative part, including judges and other things. Judges talk about having these incredible backlogs, and instead we have things like, Sessions ordering all these immigration judges with big backlogs down to the border to so-called address the emergency, and they're sitting there reading the newspaper. That was literally in the Times, an immigration judge talking about this, because there's nobody there and that's not what's happening. So we need to fix the bureaucratic part of it so there isn't such this backlog. And then the other thing that I think is really important is we have to address the fact that when we privatize the criminal justice system in any way, whether it's through state prisons, jails, anything, federal prisons, but immigration, a lot of immigration enforcement, it's all privatized. When you give companies an incentive to make money off locking people up, you have to expect that they will engage in bad practices, that they will give people subhuman food, that they will pack people in like sardines under terrible conditions. And part of this is because Congress has a rule that says a certain number of beds at any given moment must stay occupied. When you do these things, it creates bad outcomes. So those are just 3 things that absolutely must be addressed.
Well, we're going to open this up for questions. We have a microphone right here if you're willing to line up. We also have our hashtag immigration, JWJI, and you can tweet it to us, and our Twitter handle is JWJIMRA. So go ahead, Min.
My name is Laura Nieto, and I am Latina. I was at one point undocumented, but not now. Actually, I served the USA. I became a veteran because of the GI Bill, and I was able to go to university in Spanish and became a teacher. I had lived in Europe for many years, which in Germany, and I know they had the same problem of immigrants, of refugees coming to the country. I mean, there are about 900, close to 1 million refugees they have accepted. And I was just there a few months ago before the election, so into America. And this question, I asked them, how do you feel about all this 900 refugees coming to your country, in this tiny, small country, nothing compared to the USA? And they said, well, we really need them. And this is what they expressed. They said that they need them because they're spending quite a lot of money now, educate them on the language. They have to get a diploma so they can go to work. They want to be integrated. They don't want to be in their own barrios or places. And the reason is that we're doing this, and they have, after they have the diploma, you are going to be paid the same amount of money as the regular native German. And the reason they're doing is because the population in Germany is very low. So they need people in order to pay for their retirement. They pay taxes, they work, they are paid at the same level, and they will have secure their retirement when they become older now. So how do you feel about here, the US? I know I agree with all what you're talking about, but Social Security is really might not exist for the new generation. And other countries are thinking in a completely different side. They put that money on the wall. Actually, maybe they can educate some Latinos who would like to have a better job and earn more money and pay more taxes.
I'll answer. So you're absolutely right. Social Security is going broke. Even people at my age, we don't know what will happen. Part of the problem is the disparate nature of the number of people that are retiring, right, and the number of workers. So if you follow that logic, we absolutely need workers from that kind of perspective. I do think, though, that other countries have adopted different strategies towards immigrant integration and programs and policies. And so the kind of training that you're talking about, or investment in education and other things like that, the US doesn't have the same type of investment, and when they have done that, they've done it for specific immigrant groups for very specific political reasons, and we don't necessarily have that. But I think in general, it would probably be very wise for the country to spend and allocate resources differently in education for all people, immigrants and Native people, right? So that's kind of a problem more systematically across the country, but you're right, there's very different attitudes, and regarding whether Germany, they are a leader on the both raw percentage and the raw number of refugees that they took, but they took a very moral standpoint that what the problems that people were facing. This was a humanitarian crisis, and they felt a moral obligation to do so. Those types of arguments are generally less salient in the US government when you're talking about these politics. And so I think that that's how we're seeing the president suggest refugee levels that are lower than any president has advocated for, Republican or Democrat, in the last 3 decades, right? So that's not necessarily what's driving policy in the same way here.
It is estimated if immigration was reduced significantly, then the population in Western Europe would be negative, like population growth. So definitely countries need immigration to replenish the population. For the US, because we have a lot of immigrants, so the population crisis, the issue is not in the immediate future. But by 2040, if immigration remains at the same level or reduce, then the US population would start to drop. So when you have a declining population, you know the consequences, right? You know, the older population will increase.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you all for being here and for the time that you spent with us. So I was very interested about this topic on perspective and facts. And I know there's this narrative about immigration being bad and immigrants being all this stuff, right? And there's a good population in the US that believes this, even if it's only a perspective and not real facts. And even when you present them with facts, they won't accept them. So the big question for me would be, how do you maintain a dialogue open with people like this?
I think a public forum like that we hope that would increase understanding and it would increase the dialogue. And then also school classrooms and university interacting with the community to have more conversation about this. Because sometimes I notice that people on the ground, because we live in segregated social world, so sometimes we don't know what other groups or immigrants live and what kind of challenges that they are facing, and we may not understand. But with greater kind of exchange and communication and dialogue,
it would seem to me also that there's a disconnect between what social scientists are doing and are finding and what the public perceives. I think we need to do a better job as social scientists to communicate this to the general public, and I think this is a great forum for some.
Well, I mean, I also say, I'm tired, right? Like, I'm putting a lot of this work on white folks because there's only but so much I can say that people are going to listen to. And I have a PhD, and I write about this all the time, and I write op-eds, right? But I think there are a lot of conversations, and I'm sure lots of you have either said this or heard this after the election. It's like, well, I didn't vote for Trump, but my dad did, or my uncle did. It's like, your uncle's not going to listen to me. Your uncle might listen to you. So like, that person has to do the work. So you can arm your friend with the facts, but then your friend has to do the heavy lifting. So, we're all entitled to our own opinions. We're not entitled to our own facts, but I think the genius of this particular administration is that they've literally called this conversation of facts into question, right? And so, like, professors are these people that sort of espouse things that may or may not be true. And it's like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean reality is not real anymore? It's like, it's a magic trick now. So I think, honestly, there's only, I think, being realistic about the heavy lifting that you can do, because there's so many other fights that you need to give your energy for. Like, there's just certain people who, they can't hear the truth. They will forever be blind because they are ahistorical and they cannot understand anything that you're saying, possibly because you were saying it. But everyone's ever been in a faculty meeting, a white person can say it and they'll understand it, right? So I think that there might be times where you have to put the work on other people. It can't just be the diversity super friends doing all the work and trying to save this country. It has to be white people who have to help us too. And if they're closest to the problem, then they have to be the solution.
I think what you're getting at, though, is that there is a concept that social psychologists call cognitive dissonance. No. That our mind is likely to reject information that conflicts with our prior opinions. And we know that actually some individuals, when confronted with factual information from a non-biased source, and social science has really established this pretty seriously, that even then, not only do people reject it, they double down and even further go the other direction when presented with that information. So cognitively, it actually poses this real issue with exactly what you're describing. So I think that one of Min's points is excellent, which is that you have to think about, well, when people are starting to get the information that lays their opinion, where does that come from? Where does it start? So schooling has been super reluctant to engage in what I would call truth-telling regarding history and regarding power structures and structural issues in this country. I see this all the time through my children's curriculum, and I am that annoying parent who's always there and is like, oh, really? Okay, let me tell you. And unfortunately for you, I'm the expert on this, and you are not. But that's where somewhere it has to start, and it also has to start with the kinds of conversations that parents have with their children. We know, again, from psychologists, children are not born with these attitudes. It is a learned behavior that they learn from culture, from society, but also primarily from their parents and their family and their social network, and living in these segregated communities. We know that white parents are really reluctant to talk about race with their children and racial disparities and acknowledge racial privilege and all kinds of things. We know the opposite happens with parents of color. From birth, essentially, they're talking about it from the beginning, in part because they see it as a literal life survival strategy, okay? And so I think another thing is we have to talk differently to our children, but also elites, and elites who are, we know, again, the public hews really closely to what elites are saying. But if elites who look like you are never the messenger of this opinion or these facts, that's a problem. You have Jeff Sessions going on TV over and over and over again, drawing a line between immigrants and criminality, even though all the empirical research, regardless of political orientation of the researcher, has shown there is no relationship, and actually it's a reduced level of crime by undocumented immigrants and in immigrant communities, reduced levels. Less likely, because think about it. If you're undocumented, do you want police looking at you? No, you want to be flying under the radar, okay? And so when you have those elites with that message that's reinforcing a stereotype, it's really hard to confront with other facts. So part of it is also putting pressure on elites to actually talk about facts. But that's really difficult in an era, as Christina mentions, in which somehow facts seemingly don't matter, and what is a fact is fundamentally being challenged.
Yeah. I'm going to put in a plug for JWJI. It's in part, we video record all of our stuff for a reason, so almost all of our stuff ends up on a YouTube page, and you can access all of our stuff on the website. So we know that you are benefiting from this right here, right now, but as our stuff goes up, you can always go through that catalog and look this stuff up. So maybe if you're not willing to receive it now, or somebody is not willing to receive it now, maybe a few months from now, they're actually willing to sit down and watch a video and perhaps, you know, be able to learn from such a great panel of folks. So we can go on to the next question.
So thank you again for all your thoughts and what you shared today, and I agree with a lot of your points. And one thing that really resonated with me is the idea of what you were saying, how we as in people of color can only do so much. And how the onus has to be transferred to other people in positions of power to have more influence. And to that extent, you know, I ask, how would you respond to criticism or to the idea that while the topics that we engage in today are very progressive and essential to our future, they're being done in institutions like Emory University, like Harvard, like UCLA, places that are already of higher learning, tend to be liberal, tend to be more progressive. Whereas the people who tend to support the other views more strongly aren't at these institutions, more so in rural America, middle America. How do we reach those people and, you know, talk about the sense of skilled labor, right? How the idea that unskilled workers emigrating from Mexico, from El Salvador, from Colombia, wherever they're coming from, they're not coming to take the same jobs that native unskilled workers are, right? You're not going to see someone come from Mexico work at Aldo because they don't speak English. So how do we reach those people and have that conversation, not just here at Emory and other schools where we all tend to think alike and they're like, yeah, of course that makes sense, but it doesn't reach other people.
I respectfully disagree and say that the people who, let's just say, I'll call them Trumpites, they are here.
Yes.
They're at Fordham, they're at UCLA, they're at Harvard. They are here. They might be the silent majority, as Trump likes to call them, and they might not speak up, but they damn sure are here. They're the ones who built this place, right? These are institutions. They're institutions for a reason. So just because they may not say it to your face, they most definitely are here. So don't think that they're just in the cornfields in Iowa.
No, right. To that extent, how do we still reach them? How do we?
Well, they're here. So like, find out where they are here, right? Because the thing is, I think the hat trick that they pulled is that the people who voted in this administration are like poor people from the mountains, and they're all white, and they like put their good tooth in, and that's who they are. It's like, no. Wealthy people voted for this administration. Middle class people, which we refuse to define, but that's
53% of white women.
You know, 53% of white women. So somebody in here voted for Trump, just numbers wise, right? And poor people. So like they're all here. They are in Atlanta. They're not in Georgia. They're in Atlanta. They're at Emory University, and you can find them here and sort of start to chip away. Because the thing is, that's also part of the problem. We're sort of isolated even when we're next to one another. And I think some people, because they perceive this as a liberal institution, it's like, oh, well, my opinion is not really going to be valued here, so I'm just going to keep my opinion to myself. But I'm still going to work on all these causes that I would view are antithetical to progressive politics, right? So you have an easy task. They're on this campus. Like, you don't even have to go out to, you know, beyond Macon to find them. I would say, probably this building.
I agree with that completely. Most people would say Seattle is one of the most left places in the country. It is so not true. It is true in some ways, but actually I have observed some really regressive attitudes. In particular, for example, I've never lived anywhere in the country other than when I lived in Kentucky where somebody looked at me crazy for speaking to my children in Spanish. In Seattle, the entire north side is white, and literally I had others turn around, white women look at me, and they were confused because I was white passing and wondering, what is going on? We never hear Spanish, what's happening? What's this woman doing? And then you see these negative attitudes, and you have people come to class at the University of Washington, a so-called left institution, wearing Make America Great Again hats. Oh, we can be sure they voted for Trump, for sure. There's tons of people. Eastern Washington, super conservative. So this is not a coastal thing, coastal elite thing. This is not a liberal institution thing. There are people of all kinds of political views in all kinds of institutions. There are institutions that are fundamentally conservative. There are some, institutions that are more left-leaning, but there's always a diverse group of people, and we can absolutely have conversations across this. And I think events like this is one of the ways in which you put information out there into the institution and the public. But I think Christina's absolutely right that fundamentally these institutions were definitely started by people who more or less align with this type of politics. And I think that there's a lot more people who are drawn to Trump's politics than openly admit. And there's tons of evidence that this is not a segregated within certain parts of the country, that within most places of the country, there are people and across economic groups, and where the only place we don't see as much diversity is across racial groups. We do know from the 2016 outcomes that the largest supporters of Trump were white people, and that in other groups that number was pretty small, and there was actually less people that voted for the Republican candidate in this election amongst Latinos and Asians than in any prior election. So we actually see convergence going towards the Democratic candidate in the other groups, but there's absolutely people, and there's no way that they're all concentrated in places. But you're right that this is on some level a bubble, right? It's not the same as your community, but that's why all of us in our personal interactions, but also do public forums as well. And we all have to do that labor, and it absolutely has to be shared. It can't just be, I'm constantly making my pitch about immigration and no one's ever talking to anybody about it, right? So everybody has to be doing that work.
I agree with my colleagues, but I will say that I can understand where you're coming from with your question, because I've been surprised in the last 10 months or so by my more emboldened or embrazened, perhaps, students, peers, friends, or maybe not friends, colleagues, by them sort of coming out of the woodworks now, because I was not expecting them, so I can absolutely understand your perspective.
Thank you.
So for the final two questions, I was wondering if you could just state your question very quickly, and then we'll get the respondents to respond to them both in kind. So.
I'll try to be brief. Hi. I am going to try to humbly break maybe that level of isolation by playing devil's advocate. And as a disclaimer, I am a Syrian national on temporary protected status. So and I get this argument a lot from my friends, especially in Europe, where they get a lot of waves of refugees. I feel like we've touched on socioeconomic effects of immigration a lot, but maybe not as much on the cultural effect. And from the arguments I heard from you and from what my reading, and I'm not a researcher in the field, I feel like there definitely is a change brought upon the country by immigrants. Some people consider it positive, some people negative, and it might be changing now compared to the previous waves of immigration. Or is it? Is there more than perceived cultural change in the historically multicultural country than there was before? And my second question, to get even more controversial, is it perhaps a property or downside of democracy that a subset of the population is able to voice their concerns about this cultural change through a candidate like Donald Trump to attempt to establish and protect their version of the national identity in the U.S.
Thank you for your panel. One thing that we heard of very little, especially in the convergence of immigration and race politics in the U.S. is the role of U.S. militarism. Colin Kaepernick's, or sort of the athletes, the black athletes who protested over the weekend, over this past whole week, have constantly been sort of target of this critique that the American flag stands with. There's some kind of, I'm not American, so there's some kind of correlation between the military, the troops, and the American flag. And in standing in most of the world, actually, you wonder why should there be respect for the American military? What has it done any place in the world, at least since World War II, that actually requires respect? And so even on whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, there's this, it's taken as axiomatic that there's certain things that are sacrosanct. And it is precisely from those locations that one finds the roots of all the xenophobia, of this othering. And it's not just ideological, right? There's material relations. Most of the GDP of this country, actually, the highest proportion of it goes to the military, which doesn't just mean that there are people who are just going out there and being like soldiers and stuff. We're also selling aircrafts, we're selling technologies, we're producing those things, people work in those jobs, right? So it's material relations, and not just ideological ones. And maybe those could explain why Venezuela and North Korea can be sort of lumped in with the Muslim bands. Right?
Thank you.
So I'll just tackle this one really quickly. I mean, I think your point's really well taken. I mean, think about the U.S. military and, you know, all the countries that we had intervened in and all the countries we refuse to intervene in just because they don't have anything that we want, right? And I think, you know, even with, I don't call him Jeff Sessions, I call him Jefferson Beauregard Sessions because he's named after two white supremacists. And so I think that it's really important now that we're having this debate as to whether or not artillery from Afghanistan and Iraq should be in our U.S. cities, which brings in a real question. It's like, you know, we can't have tanks on American citizens. It's like, yeah, but should we have tanks on other citizens as well? Like, these bring up some much larger philosophical questions. I'm not a philosopher, but I do think about these things at night. But I think that there is this real correlation between like the American military standing for sort of like white male strength, right? And at the root of this whole administration is this fear of losing sort of this white male strength, right? With all these women taking jobs and these brown people coming in, right? And so I think what Trump is doing pretty masterfully is really sort of constantly this dog bark of like these rich black Negroes, right? That we let be in this country. And these white owners who are sort of like not controlling these black boys, right? We're just letting them run amok. And there's this notion that the military is white male. The military is not white male. The military is men and women. And it's a lot of people of color.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's a lot of immigrants who are using the military as a path to citizenship. Like, you shouldn't have to put your life on the line, literally, in a war that is questionable, right? The series of, just to get some sort of citizenship, and other people don't have to do that. So I do think that there's a much larger connection, and I haven't read sort of the great book that sort of links in the past history of, we are a bellicose nation, we've been at war for all but 26 years of our entire existence. You know, some of them completely made up wars, some of them legit, some of them not, right? And what that means for sort of like white male strength and this perception of losing white male strength and tied into patriotism. The whole standing for the flag thing is new. It's from 2009. Yes. It's not even from 2001 after 9/11. So like, it's not even a history of this. We also have Supreme Court cases that say you don't have to stand up for the flag. You don't have to stand up for the pledge. And let's also not let this administration co-opt the argument, because the argument isn't about patriotism with the flag. It's about anti-black racism and police brutality, right? So if we're being honest about what it's really about, it has nothing to do with the flag. This is a moment where we say as a nation, it's supposed to be quiet reflection to think about the liberties and justices we have. Colin Kaepernick saying, it's not equitable for everyone. So I'm gonna use this as an opportunity. So I do think that this connection between the military, the hyper flag, the anthem, white maleness, the fact that you have a president using his bully pulpit to make this pronouncement about sort of the bad Negroes, right? And now we see on the internet that even Coach Tomlin's being called one of the bad Negroes. I'm being polite, right? I think that all these things are completely interconnected. And I think the athletes who chose to kneel versus the ones who were just locking arms, which is a waste of time as far as I'm concerned, because that's not the argument. Like, yeah, we've got unity, who cares, right? That's not the issue at all. And I think that it's really unfortunate, because we're not really ever going to have the conversation that we should have, because this is the problem. We are now seeing what happens when Reconstruction is not complete, right? Germany completed it. They were like, we see a swastika, you're done, right? It's over. Like, we are not ever gonna go back. Hitler was a bad thing, and we are never gonna vacillate. This country never finished Reconstruction, so we're still vacillating on this idea of like, oh, child slavery bad? I don't know, you should sort of be thankful you had a job, right? Like, no other country is really doing what we're doing, and it's really problematic, and now all the chickens are coming home to roost from all these different levels.
Can we get a response to the first question? I just want to be sure.
Yeah, so I won't address the second question, but I absolutely agree with Christina completely. And so, in regards to your question, I think one of the issues that you raise is this a legitimate concern? Is this about cultural threat? And so I absolutely think a lot of this is motivated by cultural threat. But I want to pose to you the idea that first of all, there's no official language in this country, even though people believe there is. English is not the official language of this country. Many countries have official language. US does not. English is not official language. American is not synonymous with white. No matter how much people want that to be true, it is not true. It never has been true, because the people who were here first were not white. That can't be true. I'm serious. And so I start with my classes with this, like, okay, you started this country trying to essentially brutalize Native people, right? And do all kinds of terrible, bad things. You've created an awful situation in their current situation, right? And so I think that if we start from the point where it's never been that way and there's always been movement, then that also challenges this narrative. Let's say that the country for a long time was white dominant. Okay, well that's problematic, because you had forced slavery where you brought people. So at a minimum, even if you want to pretend Native people didn't exist, at a minimum it was white and black. So how was it always white? I keep coming back to that, like, huh? What? Why? Second, all countries, especially as global migration and a global economy, all countries on some level have experienced different levels of migration over time. People move for different reasons. There's push-pull factors. That's going to happen. And we know that we're in the largest period of movement across the globe, not even just here, right? And so if you're going to have that, places change. It's the same way that, as people have referenced, when there were immigrants coming from Ireland, from Italy, right, there was negative reaction to those groups. And there was negative reaction that those groups were not white and that they would fundamentally change the culture of the country because they came from a Catholic background or they came from a different like Mediterranean type phenotype, right? All kinds of things that were asserted. So the idea that a culture or something stays completely static and that the exact makeup of the people stays the same, I'm not sure that that's actually ever that common. And in fact, we study cases where there's an extremely homogeneous population that hasn't changed very much, and we study them because they're so unusual, right? So if you look at, like, for example, Japan has been studied for a long time in this context. I don't think that the US has ever really been like this. We've had different flows of migration, and when people say that they're culturally concerned, you have to ask, what is it that you're losing? What is it that you feel like you're losing? And I fundamentally would suggest that what people feel like they're losing is they feel like they're losing the idea that they are the dominant group that's in control. But we are absolutely still in a society that is controlled by white supremacy. We are still a long ways off from it not being, because just look at how many presidents we've had that were not white. Look what happened when we had a black president, and look what the reaction was. You have to contextualize all of this as a backlash in some ways, right? If you think about it that way, look at who's elected to office. It's changing at local and state levels, but just look at Congress, right? Look at all these things. This fear of loss of white male power is so strong, though, but it's completely divorced from political power, and it's divorced from wealth in the country. Wealth is so disproportionate across groups that even college-educated Latinos and African Americans have less net wealth than whites who did not complete college. Let that sink in and tell me whether there's much for people to be concerned about. And even if you were losing it, so what? That means that things would actually be equal and that you wouldn't have this disproportionate level of power. That's my response to it.
Okay. Yeah, to respond to your question about the relationship between immigration and cultural change, I totally agree with what you say, but I would add that cultural change occurs, but on a very service level. So in a way, culture actually enrich our life. Like, think about food, right? Think about, language. Think about lifestyle. Think about music, arts. Because of immigration, our culture is so much enriched. And then the other point is what you make so eloquently is that even though on the service level, there is a lot of change impacted by immigration, but the basic social structure and our system of stratification and our constitution has remained intact. So what's the concern about cultural change, right? And if anything, it should enrich our lives.
We're going to have to make that the final word, so please join me in thanking you.